The format this evening is that Patrick Dunleavy is going to speak about the book for 15 minutes or so. And then we've got a comment from our distinguished panel, who are Barry Quirk, Chief Executive of Lewisham Council, Joe Grice, Chief Economist at the Office of National Statistics, and Edwin Lau, who heads the OECD's Public Sector Directorate. And then after that, we'll turn to you for your comments and questions. So, Patrick, over to you.
Okay. So, I'm going to just present a few slides from the book, and Leandro Carrera is sitting over here. He, as you probably will all know, is the technical guru behind the book, and so if anybody has really techie questions, I'll refer them immediately to Leandro. This is a book that was funded actually by a donation from a very large private company, which is now HP, the computer company. And it's good to see James John sitting in the audience here from HP. And it was also developed over a long period of time that we were doing a lot of work for the National Audit Office. So I just wanted to thank them as well, because there's a lot of material that we learned while we were doing stuff for the National Audit. So this is the book that you've probably all seen already, so I'll skip over that. Government sector productivity has been around as a concept for a long time, but it hasn't actually really been very much measured. Productivity, just at its simplest, would mean outputs divided by inputs. And in the past, measuring outputs, getting to an overall measure of outputs in the public sector has been quite tricky to do. And for a long time, we didn't do it. So we would just count public sector inputs, costs or staff or whatever, and then we would imagine that public sector outputs were the same as the inputs, and then we would enter that into the national statistics and divide the inputs by the inputs, which actually is equivalent to assuming that government sector productivity is always 1, it's always flat. And there are various very good reasons why that position was maintained for a long time, even though everybody knew that it wasn't strictly correct. But since the Atkinson report in 2005, we've made a lot of progress in the idea of how we can get to an overall measure of outputs. And essentially what we do is we look at the administrative costs and weight the mix of outputs that an agency is doing by its administrative costs. So productivity is best measured if you've got lots of agencies doing the same thing. But the agencies where you have very decentralized provision are usually doing services which require a lot of personal delivery, of decentralized professional delivery. And actually in these services, quality of service is very, very important. So although we've had a lot of studies of productivity at the decentralized level, they haven't usually got into controlling appropriately for quality of service. So it's possible that you can have very perverse productivity signals in these decentralized studies. So neither at the national government level nor at the decentralized level have we made as much progress as we would like. I'm going to mainly just talk about the national government level, and I'm just going to show you a few pictures of productivity in 3 agencies: the UK Customs, the Tax Collection Agency, which is now Emergency Revenue and Customs, and the Department of Social Security. And the first thing to say about these departments is they're unique. Most governments have only one of these departments. So there's nobody else to compare them with, and you can't easily do comparative studies. If we had excellent comparative data on productivity, we would be able to compare, let's say, the British Tax Agency and the American and so on. But sadly, we have very poor international data on public sector productivity. And we've also had a lot of pushback by civil servants and governments who have always tended to say, well, we're very sui generis, you can't evaluate us using just productivity base alone. So what we've done really in the first part of the book is to focus on particular agencies or departments. And government agencies exist for a long time. There's a body of work in the academic literature that says perhaps they're even immortal. We have agencies that date back to the 13th century in the UK. We've focused on fairly standard operations, fairly standard administrative operations, and we've just really tried to look for, is there a quality problem? Has the agency stopped doing something or really degraded the quality of what it's doing? If not, we're going to assume that it's broadly standard quality. And you might ask me questions about that. And then we're focusing particularly on organization. So we've had a lot of national statistics data that are about very large sectors, like the whole of the healthcare sector or the whole of the education sector, whatever. But our focus is particularly on organizational productivity, which is a story that we think is most relevant for organizational managers. So here's a graph for the UK customs across this decade. And in all of the graphs I'm going to show you, I'll whiz quickly through them. The pink graph line shows you the volume of inputs as an index number, and the blue line shows you the volume of outputs, and the green line shows you the overall productivity, which is the outputs divided by the inputs. Now this story for customs is a story of very rapid productivity growth that was sustained for a long period of time, and it was mainly achieved by by two things really: bringing in a computer system to track imports and exports, which is what we're looking at here, and then also changing the way in which they did modernizing the way in which they did their administration, moving from sort of randomly opening up containers in the hope of detecting things going wrong to very much intelligence-based, risk-based assessment. The interesting thing about this graph really is that you can have very substantial growth in organizational productivity in the public sector. Essentially here, the volume of inputs was pretty static throughout the decade, whereas the volume of trade that was being handled went up, and you had a very substantial increase in productivity. If we look at tax collection, again, the pink is inputs, the blue is outputs, and the green is productivity. You can see that actually it was pretty flat for a very long period of time. It bobbled around a bit, but it didn't really grow until there was two major things happened. The first was that our tax and our customs agencies were amalgamated in 2005. And there were quite a lot of synergies that developed from that. And the second thing is that after a rather slow start, Inland Revenue and later Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs started to make substantial savings from the use of online tax forms. Now we're up to about 4 out of 5 people submitting their self-assessment income tax forms online. Yes, certainly. Okay, thank you very much. So that's the tax thing. We can look at this in another way, which is just looking at by the amount of tax collected. And again, we don't see a huge, it's rather flat for a long period, but we do see a growth right at the end. If we look at Social Security in Britain, the story is rather depressing. During the Blair years, there was a big reorganization of the Social Security Department, and productivity fell hugely during this reorganization period because the number of staff went up, but the volume of cases basically stayed the same. After a while, the management got more out of the new procedures and the new reforms and the new benefits that have been introduced. But there was a very substantial slump, and really at the end of the period, it's very hard to see the DWP productivity as being better than it was at the beginning. And in fact, we've done a slightly flakier, long-run effort to track the DWP and the Social Security function in the UK. And over 20 years, which is a long time in the history of the world, really productivity was pretty flat. There were two big dips. There was a bit when it came back, but it hasn't really improved. So certainly this is a different picture from the one we saw with customs. And one of the problems that DWP had is that they made a strategic misdecision. In the early 2000s, they decided to remodel their whole administrative systems from being very much based on sending things in on paper forms in the mail to basing them around a phone-based system. And this is what happened. You can see that they had a huge explosive growth of phones by about 2005. 3 years later, they managed to get the number of rather pointless phone calls down in a huge management effort, which actually pushed up the amount of stuff that was coming in by post. And they had also cut down the amount of face-to-face communication, which saved a lot of money. But there's one missing thing here, which is that the proportion of services that was done online hadn't shifted at all. When we did a report for the National Audit Office, David Darragh, he's sitting here, we showed that 0.5% of their customer transactions were online in the same year as 74% of self-assessment income tax forms were coming in online, and in the same year when over half of the DWP customers were themselves online with broadband internet access. So sometimes you can make very bad decisions and you can just miss what's going to be happening. Now the DWP has a completely different approach, and they have a target of achieving 80% of their customer transactions online by 2015, which I would predict they're not going to make, but we'll see. So those are the pictures across the agencies. I just want to round up with trying to think about what are the key factors that we observe. Now, I'm just going to show you 3 pictures which reflect our long-running effort to try and create some meaningful data from the government statistics that are available. And just to focus on 3 things. The first thing is, well, does spending a lot of money on ICT, on communication technology and IT, does it increase government productivity? And the answer is that there is a reasonable association. You can see that there's a bit of scatter, so it's not marvelous, but maybe 45% of the variation might be explained by this. Now that's just one graph. We also looked at another factor, which was the overall managerial reorganization of things. And one of the difficulties that we have is trying to identify when managerial reorganization has occurred. So the index that we use is the amount of money spent on PFI spending that's really basically construction. When you do new buildings, you tend to reorganize your production processes. You can see that in HMRC and DWP very, very strongly. So here we look to see, is there a lagged link between spending on new buildings, which usually entails reorganizing what you're doing, and then productivity going up. And on the whole, it's not a bad association. There are some strange data points that we're a bit unhappy about, but there's some impact. And then the final thing we looked at was, well, does spending a lot of money on consultancy help you increase your productivity? And the answer is no. It doesn't do any good at all. So let me just round up by saying, at the end of the book, we try to set out some key steps to achieving sustainable public sector productivity growth. And the first step is you've got to focus on productivity. If you just say the word but don't focus on it, don't collect the statistics, don't look at it really, really hard, don't give it priority, and don't come back to it every year and try to get better, you're not going to get better. That's the first thing. And it's strange to me that the National Audit Office, for example, never publishes anything on government sector productivity. I think they should, but they don't. And it's strange to me that we've had governments of left and right, and they've been very variable on whether they've consistently pursued higher productivity. Secondly, inside the public sector, innovation is very important. Edwin and I were just discussing before the talk with a group of students who are doing some research for OECD, the tremendous importance of public sector innovation. In a private industry, half of the productivity growth that happens in, let's say, a 10-year period will be because less efficient firms close down and custom transfers to more efficient firms. Now, you can try and do things inside the public sector to replicate that effect, but they're very, very weak, and they're very partial, and they don't usually endure. The enduring thing that really affects public sector productivity is internal innovation in public sector agencies. So, my rule of thumb is it's twice as important as it is in a private sector. Thirdly, you need to engage public sector workers. Innovation is something that really relies a lot on detailed, serial efforts by people who really know what they're doing, really know what's happening on the grassroots. You can only get that if you create the appropriate kind of public trust, and people who are running these agencies see that things are going to get better if they reveal information to management. If they reveal information to management, and then the managers say, oh, thanks very nicely, we'll fire some of you, then you're not going to get sustainable innovation. Fourthly, you need to think about this demand transfer across suppliers. It's very hard to do, but it could be if it's genuine. So you don't want to do the kind of thing the British government has done in IT, which is create a hugely oligopolistic market with a few main contractors who basically don't compete very strongly. That doesn't really give you succession or transfer across suppliers. So you need to think of a more mixed economy kind of way of doing things that creates intra-governmental competition, brings in third sector organizations, and so on. All of that might have more impact in genuine supplier demand transfers. And finally, sad to say, but true, the old standard social democratic faith that having a big government is going to be a pathway to social equality does not work if you have a low productivity public sector in a high productivity country. That the evidence is pretty strong, but that does not reduce social equality. And so the appropriate way of creating social equality is not to have a sort of large, padded, not very good public sector, but to have an efficient, high-performing public sector with strong wages for the workforce in the public sector that then helps maximize economic growth and national wealth and creates more of a basis from which you can have an efficient welfare state redistribution. So there's some points in here that people on the right will find not very congenial, and some points that people on the left will find not very congenial, but actually we really need to think about this as a long-run problem and set in place the right ways of tackling it. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Patrick.
I'm employed in local government and have been for 30 years, and I spend a lot of time trying to work out how we can improve. And I spend time essentially looking at theory, looking at practice, and encouraging my organisation to be as innovative as possible. When I'm searching around for theory, I look at books. I can't find any that actually gives about management economics for organisations. Can't find hardly any that are relevant and useful for the public sector. There's a lot, particularly because of if it's about government or the public sector, that actually rests on policy analysis or believes that innovation comes from political challenge and insurgency and new policy initiatives. But there's very little that actually talks about where innovation and where change happens, which is in organisations. So I actually was delighted to read the book because it focuses on organisations. And actually I thought it blended with my personal history, because for 6 years I actually was a non-exec director on both customs and then revenue and HMRC. So I sort of read through the tax bits quite avidly as well. And I do think it's unusual to find something that is useful to practitioners, because it's focused on organisation. There's far too much that's produced, which is really policy initiative after policy initiative, or looking at systems. And when you're trying to make something productive, it's either a class or a school system. It's either a team of people working in something, or it's the assets that you've got, or it's the whole organisation, or it's the system. And there's too much analysis, for my liking, on systems and on national policies, and not enough on how can we make organisations work. So I think this was absolutely hit the nail on the head the book achieved. I also think that I liked in particular the section about digital era governance and productivity and the connection that we're now seeing between productivity improvement and investment in IT, although that was for many years not considered to be, following Brynj Olsen's work and so on, considered not to be an evidenced route. It now looks reasonably so from your 45%, I noticed. So I really like that section, but I particularly love the section, the general focus on organisational learning, and particularly on how organisations can learn. I'd suggest that you look at the 24 generic suggestions on table 10.1 at the back, which is quite a useful thing about how organisations can learn and improve. Essentially, managing organisations is about empowered, measured risk-taking for all the people in the organisation. I'm leading an organisation managerially that takes some people's children into care, and it also collects their rubbish. But it doesn't do it on the same round. Now we have specialties, and it's about how you empower and measure and enable people to take measured risks in each of these specialties, not applying the same approach to every area. So I think it's absolutely crucial that we have an organisational focus. I thought, actually, at last I found a book that addresses these issues, but doesn't look at local government. That's good. Actually, at last it doesn't mention libraries, because I've had 3 years of dealing with libraries. But actually, on page 324, just 2 pages before the end, there's a whole page on libraries, and I thought, oh no. So I congratulate Leandro and Patrick on producing what is, I think, a very important and insightful book. My views on the subject that they raise are really that there is a danger in the commentary about the new public management, which says that new public management is unsuccessful. New public management has failed. The danger in that commentary is that actually it promotes a sort of fatalism, that there's nothing that you can do and that it's happenstance or it's just random. Now, I studied many years ago educational performance, and before, in the 1970s and 1980s, it was commonplace that people felt that all you needed to do was analyse the inputs to a school, and the inputs to a school are the pupils. And if you study the inputs, you'd be able to predict the outputs. And it wasn't until 1982 when Michael Rutter wrote a book called 15,000 Hours, and the book was actually about secondary schools matter. And there is variation in the performance of schools, and this variation is something to do with the abilities of the leadership of the school and the teaching in the school and the quality of teaching in the school. Now, we've now come to a position 30 years later where we seem to believe that schools are the only thing that matters. I think we've gone too far. It is a mixture of the socio-economic circumstances of the people that go to the school and a mixture of the abilities of the leadership and management of the school. But to believe that it's not a function, that outputs and social results and education attainment is nothing to do with the leadership of the school would lead, I think, it's almost unorthodox now. And I think if you apply that logic to prisons, to councils, to hospitals, to all organisations, you'd say, actually you need meliorists, people who are not optimists that believe that things are going to work out well, or pessimists that believe the past was better, but people that actually want to make things better in the management of their organisation, whether that's a school or a council or a hospital or a prison or whatever. And I think focusing attention on what is it that makes organisations productive, looking at cost weighting, looking at taking account of quality is absolutely crucial. Because the agenda, I think, for people that are managing organisations now in the public sector is about cost reduction, productivity improvement, and demand and supply management. And I think that what the book does is it raises these issues, and it's above all a useful book. What matters to me isn't that we're productive, but we're productive with purpose. We're purposefully productive. I actually looked at the top 3 books that were read in our libraries. I asked the chief librarian on my way here today, I said, what are the most 3 books that were read? Because there's lots of stuff about the productivity of libraries. I could talk to you about productivity by square meterage or by number of librarians over time and compared to the community libraries as opposed to the council-owned libraries. But the top read book, what do you think? It's not Hilary Mantel, actually. She's second. 50 Shades of Grey is third. It's actually a book for teenagers on sex, because it's a big deal in South London, sex. And the top read non-fiction book is a book about pubs in South London. So the question is, what are the purpose of libraries, not just what's their productivity? And I think that's the case of all of our services. What's the purpose of it? How can we repurpose it as well as improve its productivity? So again, I'd like to congratulate Leandro and Patrick on what is a very thoughtful and useful book. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. This is a subject which is very close to my heart. Having spent most of my career in the Treasury, I spent a very happy and I thought useful year actually, working with the team that Sir Tony Atkinson assembled back in 2004, the Atkinson Review that Patrick's already talked about, which was commissioned to look at how would we measure public service output. Tony, being Tony, made really quite a big inroad into that. I'd like to deal with 3 issues really in the time available to me. The one is to say a bit about why this subject is important, what it is that makes it really quite central to political as well as social debate. I'd secondly like to take up one of the challenges in the introduction to the book. Why has this subject not received far more attention? Why has it been relatively neglected? And then thirdly, just to say a bit about the use that this framework gives rise to, and really to express enormous admiration, actually, as to the progress that's been made. Now, the first of those, why is this an important topic? It seems to me, first and foremost, public services are something which people value enormously. They value the health service, they value schools, they even, to a degree, I expect, value tax collection, though maybe not quite in the same way. But those services that people receive from the states are ones which they regard as very important. And actually may be peaking in around about 2001, when overall the economy seemed to be going pretty well. Other things seemed to be going not too badly, but actually huge discontent with the public services people felt they were receiving at that stage. Public services really at the heart of the 2001 general election. Tony Blair and Gordon Brown came back from that election victorious, but very much seized of the importance of this issue. Indeed, in some ways, productivity is at the centre of this, because if people have continuing rising expectations from the public services they receive, but actually at the same time, they do not have the same rising appetite to go on paying taxes, then the only way that governments can square that circle in political economy terms is to ensure that those services provided are provided more for the same, or indeed more in some cases for less. In other words, higher productivity, right at the centre of that debate. And even if people didn't care about public services, they would, one imagines, care about their taxes. Government takes nearly 40% of national income by way of taxes. Not surprisingly, people care about the stewardship of that money. Is it being used to good effect? Can they feel good about their taxes because it's producing high-quality healthcare, or do they feel actually those taxes are being wasted, at least in part? Stewardship of taxes, I think, is important and central to the political debate as well. And then thirdly, easy to overlook, but public services account for 22% of the economy, 22% of GDP. That's about twice the size of manufacturing. In fact, now slightly larger than twice the size of manufacturing in total. So this is a big part of the economy. Curious enough, actually, I think the book refers at one point to public services being 11% of the economy. I think that's probably a mistake, but whatever, it simply makes the point the books make, I think, twice as powerfully. So, 24%. There's no, anyway, that's not to the point. What matters, though, that if governments are interested in growth overall, they're interested in the economy overall, then they need to be interested in the public services, no less than they are interested in manufacturing or the production sector, all those areas where traditionally government has opined, produced policies, lectured private sector entrepreneurs. You might think that they would have a particular duty in those areas where they have rather more direct responsibility and control for the productive outcome of those enterprises for which they're responsible. And this is more, I think, both relevant in terms of measurement and policy. If you want growth in the economy, you need to know how to measure growth in this sector, and you need to know how to produce it. Now, the second point, why has this been a neglected subject? Part of the issue, I think, is actually that it's inherently not straightforward. In fact, in some ways, it's quite difficult. I very much take Patrick's point that this is not just about making vague generalizations. We actually need some metrics, some facts, some basis to be able to work, to analyze, and take forward. But actually, measuring productivity in these principally non-market sectors is not straightforward. On the whole, it's relatively straightforward to get the quantities. You know how many people are being treated by the health service. You know how many children are being taken through the school system. More difficult to know what is the quality of the health care that those people are receiving, those patients in the health service, how much value added is really being added to those children being taken through school. Now, you ignore that at its peril. It used to be the case, I think, right up until about 1990, that the Department of Health's main measure for the output of the health service was called deaths and discharges. So either you went as a patient, you were discharged and cured, it was one unit, or you went through the health service and you died, that was still the same unit. That always seems to me to be kind of the ultimate quality adjustment. But we do ignore quality at our peril, but it's not straightforward to measure. Having said it's not straightforward, it's not impossible either. A lot of people have worked for a number of years, economists and other practitioners, in working out what is the quality of the health service. Ditto, what is the quality of the education service. Barry's point again that you ignore these issues at your peril. They're not completely intractable, even if they're not straightforward. And I think one of the things that the Atkinson Review probably did was to suggest and insert the idea that a principled, a theoretical approach to quality was needed. If you just went around and chased kind of random, likely-looking variables, you could actually do more harm than good, unless there was some really well-justified basis for using those variables. And I think the other reason that this is a neglected subject is it's sort of gone politically out of fashion. You no longer get this being right at the heart of political debate as it was in 2001. And why not? Well, I think, at least in the UK, the answer in part is that governments were able, for a while, to meet those rising expectations for better public services simply by pouring money into those services. Gordon Brown's Prudence for a Purpose, perfectly respectable in its own terms, but clearly that ability to generate output of public services simply by increasing the resources available, if it was available for a time to Mr. Brown, is not available to Mr. Osborne. So returning to an environment where improvements are generated by productivity, not by pouring further resources into public services, seems to me right up against that as of now. And equally, given the apparent reluctance of our economy to grow for now 3 or 4 years, not surprisingly, Treasury, BIS, various other departments are looking at precisely that issue about shouldn't we actually be looking at productivity in our own direct sector as well as in the rest of the economy. Maybe that's part of where the malaise is. Final point, the use of the framework. What I really liked about this is it's not just a question of how do you measure, how do you produce nice metrics and so on. That's an essential, in my view, part of the agenda. But actually what the book shows really very nicely is what use you can then make of this in order to produce an agenda, recommendations for what can be done to improve productivity, not just to measure it, but actually to improve it. Patrick outlined some of the messages that come out of the book on that. What I particularly like, actually, is the fact that even if we don't have comparative information of huge volume about international comparisons, we do now increasingly have reliable and useful information about the performance of, for example, separate hospital trusts or separate schools, even I expect separate libraries. And correcting for quality, reliably based information, that seems to me to be increasingly useful. If we can only level up to the top quartile or whatever, what a huge overall improvement we would see in the aggregate outturns. All of this seems to me to suggest that even if this has been a neglected topic in the past, it isn't going to be much longer. And what seems to me to be extraordinarily well-timed in this book that we're talking about this evening is that it does produce the concepts, the techniques, the metrics, and the tools to make a key contribution to what I think are about to be returning to the centre of political debate in the UK, at least, for some time to come. So extraordinarily well-timed, extraordinarily useful, and actually, I think, really repairing that neglect in this area, which the introduction to the book quite properly draws to our attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
Well, first of all, I'd like to join the other speakers in the accolades for the book because I appreciated it very much. First of all, simply because it was very readable. And I think that oftentimes when that's not a given with a book on public sector productivity. Secondly, however, I think that as Joe, as our previous speaker just mentioned, it brings the attention squarely back onto efficiency. And I think that that's quite important. And over the last couple of years, I've noticed, at least in public management circles, this trend to say, oh, it's not about efficiency, it's about effectiveness. And you know, if you're focused on efficiency, you know, you are sort of the bean counters and you're missing the big picture. And so effectiveness and outcomes, that's really what we're about. And in a way that allowed people to get off the hook and to be able to focus on these fuzzier issues that they didn't have to measure. And secondly, it also allowed people to think about, you know, more strategic issues. Yet at the same time, it cut the link between the delivery and the productivity of organizations and their ability to focus on strategy and on the issues that they're designed or have a mandate to produce. So I think that the issue, or what the takeaway that I had from the book, is that efficiency creates the fiscal space for organizations to focus on their priority areas. And so therefore, it's not one or the other, effectiveness or efficiency, but both together. And then the third thing that I liked about the book very much, which Joe also mentioned, is that not only did it provide us with the framework, but also with some solutions. And I'll get back into that in a second. So there were very many things that I liked about the book and could talk about, but I'll just focus on three. The first is on the data issue. The second is on the incentives for innovation and for improving productivity. And the third on public sector innovation. So with regard to data, you know, very early on in the book, Patrick threw down a gauntlet for me as the OECD, saying that there's kind of a missed opportunity in terms of comparative information on productivity across countries. And that's true. I think that public multilateral organizations are ready to lead the charge in terms of collecting information on productivity, but only if countries are willing to follow. And about 10 years ago, I was working on e-government issues and got together countries to try to collect information on ICT expenditure. And I'm happy to say that the UK was one of those countries that was willing to provide us with the information and was quite eager to join in this activity. But it was only one of a handful of countries. And I think that without, there were some countries, for example, many of the Nordic countries would say, well, it's not our job to collect this information. It's all happening at the local level. Other countries were saying, well, why are we collecting this? This is not, we don't own the data, and so therefore we do not have the ability to consolidate all of this data across government. So we're getting many of these excuses, but at the same time also, I think, just a lack of understanding of why we should be collecting this information. So then in 2010, so 9 years later, that was when we were actually able to get our first collection of ICT expenditure across governments. And so therefore, to start to look at some of these issues that Patrick has addressed in terms of, for example, the ICT contribution to total factor of productivity. But I think it also shows that there are some countries which maybe in their culture or their administrative legacy have a more openness to looking at issues such as productivity or looking at value for money. And I think, well, I may be generalizing a little bit, that within the Anglo-Saxon world and in the Commonwealth countries, there is a greater willingness to take that approach, and that in many other OECD countries, that is only just now starting to develop. So we're still in early days in terms of being able to collect and compare that type of information. My second point with regard to the data is that there's a huge gap between national accounts and organizational data. And I think that the book really shows that it's at the organizational level where you're going to be able to tell some interesting stories that are going to draw conclusions for managers to manage by. And that if you only look at the national accounts, it's quite complex. I mean, in one way, you're focusing on organizations with relatively simple, and I say that in quotation marks, mandates with easily measurable outputs. And so once you start looking at what is the output of, say, diplomacy or of giving policy advice, then the whole productivity framework doesn't really work. So I think that focusing at the organizational level is the right way to go, and then to try to draw some lessons to apply them to other sectors as well. And I'm just thinking about, we had a Finnish statistician come and work with us for about 6 months looking at national productivity numbers in Finland. And really what he was explaining to me is that they would start with their national accounts information, but the work of mapping that to a real understanding of the administrative processes and data at the agency and ministry level was quite painstaking, but it was crucial to really understanding how productivity could be improved at the organizational level. So there's quite a bit of work to be done there. And just so that people don't go away saying, well, there's no hope for international comparison of productivity, the OECD spent 4 years working on its system of health accounts. And what that allows us to do, it's a handbook. I was going to bring it with me, but it's about 550 pages. But it's comparison, country across country, of how do we standardize data coming out of health systems. Now that we have that, now countries actually have to start collecting the information using those guidelines. So this is a very long and slow process, which you have to be quite patient in order to have some robust information. But it's happening, and I think that we're continuing to fight that good fight. The second area that I wanted to talk about was with regard to the incentives. And I think it's always very easy to say, here are all the things that were not covered by the book. And so I don't want to belabor that point. But at the same time, I think that while Patrick recognizes sort of the external, in particular fiscal pressures that can create a push for innovation, that oftentimes understanding the actors and the institutional relationships between those actors is quite important to see whether or not those pressures take hold. And what I mean there is, for example, ministries of finance tend to be the ones that are the most interested in trying to achieve efficiency gains or value for money. And yet, if they're standing there saying, we are going to harvest any potential efficiencies that organizations are able to offer up, then obviously the incentive to provide those efficiencies or to declare them is 0 to nil. So the types of processes that ministries of finance have put in place, be those spending reviews or automatic productivity cuts, or the types of dialogue that they have in determining fiscal consolidation measures with ministries are quite important in terms of creating those incentives to offer up innovations. And some of the work that we've done in the health sector at the OECD shows that ministries of health are not waiting for ministries of finance to come and say, oh, wake up, you need to innovate. They're thinking about it already, but they're also thinking about this as a strategy for them to reallocate internally to pay for, to find savings in one area to pay for investments in another. So once they start interacting with ministries of finance, as I said, that incentive to offer those up changes completely. And so how do you create that balance where some of the savings can be reinvested within the organization? I think from a public management perspective, we're also seeing that how information is being used for decision-making makes a big difference as well. We're seeing a growing disenchantment, for example, with performance budgeting, because we realize that at the end of the day, people are human and they find ways to get around systems no matter how clever they are in terms of trying to track their performance. So I think that having information on both efficiency and effectiveness is quite important, but not in this one-to-one, each increment of performance improvement leads to greater appropriations to an organization. We now know that that doesn't really work. However, using that information to provide the political accountability to the government of the day, the social accountability through budget transparency, other transparency to the society, and then also administrative accountability in terms of finding insights into the management of organizations to improve the management. Those are all important uses of the productivity data. And I think I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to go very quickly on my third point, which is that scale matters. So the Australian National Audit Office took a look at the impact of its automatic productivity cuts, and it found that small organizations did not have the wherewithal to be able to improve productivity to meet the cuts, and that therefore you need to have a larger or at least functional cooperation across organizations in order both to get the scale, the capability to do something, to operate on a larger scale to achieve efficiencies, and that therefore the organizational context in which these types of fiscal pressures are taking place is quite important in terms of the ability of organizations to respond to those pressures. Secondly, I think one thing I was very surprised, coming from a university, is that there wasn't that much emphasis on the role of evaluation as in part of the learning organizations, and that the use of indicators to identify the areas where drill downs were needed, both in terms of evaluation, in terms of case studies, to be able to draw information and to provide recommendations, I think is quite important to provide that feedback loop of continuous improvement. And then finally, at the international level, I think, as Patrick had mentioned at the beginning, we do think that there is learning that can be done across countries. It's quite difficult because context is quite different. As I mentioned, cultures are quite different. But the OECD Observatory for Public Sector Innovation is trying to take some early steps in terms of collecting information across countries, making that information available to practitioners, and then trying to produce the dialogue that takes place where people are not just looking at the hot new thing that's happening in Canada or in the United States, but also saying, in terms of an international community of practitioners, how are people who are facing the same challenges that I have in my daily work, how are they approaching it in a different context? And perhaps that might be one of the first steps to improving improving productivity. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we'll come to the panel. I think everybody might want to chip in on that one, but Patrick, why don't you start?
Okay, well, on representativeness of different groups, I mean, I certainly think it's the case that, this panel is not gender neutral, and it should have been. certainly, I think in the LSE as a whole, we need to make a big push towards getting to more representative panels than we have done. And we, it is actually feasible to do this. We've done that in many areas of other parts of our work. So I particularly am very proud of one blog that I am editor of, which has managed to get to a very full representation of men and women, very equal representation. I think when we come to public services productivity, it's very important to recognize that there are some systematic differences between different kinds of agencies. Most decentralized delivery agencies are predominantly staffed by women in the healthcare, education and social work sectors. And then there are some others with a male-orientated balance. When you get to the central government level, you tend to find that it's very related to ranks, so that the proportion of public servants that are male tends to rise as you get towards the top of organizations. And I think what that tends to do is to create walls and barriers between people who are pushing for, top-level reforms. They often push for these reforms in a way that's not very, diversity-orientated, that doesn't take account of the situation of grassroots workers and employees. And that tends to encourage employees to resist productivity changes. And it's perfectly rational for people to do that. So if you really want public sector productivity to grow, you actually need to work very hard at creating, I think, more gender neutral kind of agencies and cultures in agencies. That would be part and parcel of moving towards better productivity, because it would be reducing the kind of resistance to change, and then the management proposing changes that are not properly worked through. That often goes on at the moment. So I do think these issues are very important, and I also think ethnic group representation inside public services is very important for whether or not you're going to get productivity changes. But I think in some other countries in the world, these issues are even more developed than they are in the UK. So it's always going to be a sensitive thing to say public sector productivity needs to improve. A lot of people will code that as being everybody in the public sector needs to work a lot harder, and their life needs to get a lot grimmer, and conditions need to get a lot worse, and pay needs to be suppressed, and jobs need to be cut. Now that's not what we're saying in the book. And Barry mentioned the big table at the back of the book, which has got a lot of specific suggestions as to ways in which the public sector can be a nice place to work, but it can be a more productive.
You've probably got a lot of experience on this issue. What do you think about it?
Yes, I'm in a place where if Jamaica play Nigeria in football, it's a big deal. It's a bigger deal than anything else, really. So you have to know your ethnography of your place and of the place, people that you're leading. I think whether it's about providing services or delivering services or framing discussions, you've got to have as diverse a group as possible. And I think there's the issue is that we're actually paid. I'm very conscious that my salary is paid by everyone. Everyone that works in the public sector, they're not working for groups of people, they're neither are they chasing high-value people. So when I talk about demand management, we're not trying to find high-value people to sell them more stuff. We're actually trying to work out actually who needs this most. Are we delivering right and most effectively to the people that need it most? Or are there distortions in how we're designing the service? Are we involving the people that are receiving services? Because they know more about the service and their needs than actually the people providing it. So I think whether it's in design of the service itself or designing of the organisation, or framing the political choices, or making the political choices, I think you need diversity, you need to frame it properly.
You're nodding vigorously, Joe. Do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I think that's right. I think the way I get into this is to think quite hard about what we should really be meaning when we're talking about public service output. And it isn't, I think, some kind of commodity where you just happen to produce that same commodity, a bit more efficiently. That isn't productivity. And the reason I think that's got to be right is that what I think output is really about is value and value added. And what is it that users actually value? Then it seems to me you get into, first of all, being clear what people want. Secondly, not providing things which, however clever and convenient, are not what people want, have not got value in that sense. And that's why it seems to me that these points the lady from the LGA raised are important. And part of that is actually meeting the needs of all of our society, balancing that up against what is affordable. That is part of me. For me, that is, if you take the view that value added is what this output is really about, then that's what has to go into the productivity equation. Producing output that nobody wants or doesn't meet need is actually not really very productive.
So I think that, first of all, at the beginning of the book, there's a very good discussion about the differences between the public and the private sector. And one of those key differences is that the public sector has a universal service mandate. And so that means it's not just sort of the best return on investment, it's everyone. And that includes women, that includes disabled people, across the border. And so I think that's quite important, and that you have to take, you can't let your service delivery decisions be driven by productivity when you have that type of a mandate. Secondly, within the OECD, we have had this gender mainstreaming initiative, which I've learned a lot from it, because at the beginning, for people who are less familiar with these types of initiatives, you think, okay, well, then how many recipients are women and how many recipients are men? And in fact, it's not like that at all. It's really trying to understand the service better in order to understand the differences, the gender differences that have an impact on the effectiveness of the service delivery. And so, one example that was given was that for a training program in India was that if you give young men this training for building solar panels on houses, that they take the degree and they go to the city and they get jobs. But if you give it to grandmothers in those cities, that they stay in the communities and they reinvest those skills into meeting the program objectives, which is to install solar panels in the roofs of the buildings. So there, I think it's something where it's not about gender, it's about insight into the program and the community, and driving that information in order to be more effective. So I think that's something that everyone should share as a goal.
I'll do the thing of taking questions in groups of 3 or 4. So this gentleman first. Just wait for the microphone, please. And then after that, the gentleman at the end of the row there.
It's William Heath from Midex. So the point's been raised that you've sort of done the easy part, hard enough as it was. You've measured the organization-centric, the supply-side productivity, but that doesn't take into account how much time do people spend waiting in call centers, how much time do they spend going to offices, how much hassle do they incur, how effective is it, how good the services really are. My question is really about the systems that underpin that. You've made the point that the big investment in EDS, HP systems in those big departments paid a dividend. Isn't there a far bigger dividend ready to come when you've got infrastructure on the side of the individual? When individuals connecting to public services, whether it's Lewisham or the NHS or DWP, when they can prove their own credentials and trustworthiness, when they can express their preferences, when they can clean up their data, they've got a digital letterbox. But when you've got that information logistics on both sides, you're going to get orders of magnitudes improvement in productivity. So my question is, will you do your next book on that, please?
Thank you. Next to the gentleman back there at the end of the row. At the back, yeah. And then I'll come back to the front.
Thank you, Chair. Productivity. I don't think there's anyone in this room or elsewhere that would disagree that a healthy, well-educated population is an asset. So my question is, how do you persuade other people, possibly highly paid, to recognize that's for some sort of benefit? Because otherwise they turn around and say, oh, well, you want education, get it elsewhere. You want healthcare, get it elsewhere. How do you persuade other people?
Thank you. Question front here. And then after that, I'll do one more, and then we'll come back for another batch later.
Patrick, at the outset, thought that the big state solution was not the way ahead for progress. That it really prevented productivity. And we heard from Barry about the importance of contact with the consumers and the users. And we've heard about the need to draw on the insights and energy of the providers, the workers within these different services. Now, how then, if we believe in all that, are we to break the consensus, the social democratic consensus that seems to affect all parties at the national level, that everybody should have the same sort of standards everywhere, that there should be a uniformity of standards to achieve equality? How can we break the grip of that attitude that is, from what our speakers tell us, holding back public service productivity?
Thank you very much. I will take one more in this batch, and there's a gentleman there waving from the back. Thank you.
Hi. Hi, my name is Daniel Krupp, and I work in the internet and sort of policy space. My question is about how you measure ICT productivity. Because if I'm recalling correctly, and I'm sorry if I'm not, your data shows basically a positive relationship between more ICT spending and greater productivity. My question is, isn't it the case in an age of free software, free, Skype, open source software, that you might very well be missing a huge trick here? Because as you know from the NHS, sort of their experience with big IT projects, they can often be exceptionally expensive and exceptionally bad. And you can use Skype to communicate for free by video with people all around the world. So my question is, how, if all, did you take that into account? And if not, can you be more specific in analyzing precisely what might be going on beneath that spend data that you have for ICT? Thanks.
So we've got, what about user-based innovation, if I can do that just shorthand? What happens when you've got disagreement about the purposes of public services? How do you crack the tyranny of the postcode lottery, the presumption that everybody should be the same? And is spending the right way to measure ICT as an input, I think? So I think panel members take what you like out of those, reply to whichever bit you prefer. So Patrick, you first.
Well, maybe I could just pick two out of those set to respond to. The first was William Heath's point about identification. It is the case that British government IT-based and electronic services and now digital services have been constrained for years, not just years but decades, by absolutely avoidable difficulties in getting citizens to identify themselves to government electronically. I don't know how many of you have filled in a government an income tax form, but you probably have had dealings with the government gateway, one of the worst bits of our IT equipment. And in many, many cases, you can see that agencies have held off from doing something that they could have done digitally for at least a decade, in some cases for 15 years, because they haven't been able to electronically identify people. And often they will do that when they're actually meeting these same people. So the DWP, for a long time, if you wanted to register as a job seeker, they would make you phone up, and you would talk to somebody for half an hour, 40 minutes on the phone, and then you'd have to turn up at a job centre. But you weren't allowed to apply electronically because we couldn't be sure who you were. But they would all turn up at the job centre anyway. Similarly, over the years, the Passport Agency has been one of the slowest digital change agencies. You've probably all filled in these terrible passport forms that has to be photographed, and if your signature goes over this or that, or, that's because they're using a kind of 1980s technology called optical character reading, when they could have had you type it out, send it in, then call you in for an interview, which in many cases you're having to do now anyway. So, this has been a problem even when governments are meeting these people and talking to them. They haven't been able to solve the ID problem. And I absolutely agree with William, this is a huge area. And in those countries which have sorted out, like Sweden, which is relatively easy to do and straightforward, public services are immeasurably better. If you're in Sweden, for example, tax agency will collect all your income for you. You don't have to keep, a box file full of all your receipts and then fill in the tax form. They will send you a text message the day after the end of the tax year, and if you agree with their rating, you can pay it by credit card and have done with it the same day. Now that's great for actually collecting the money. We are 20 years off doing that in the UK, I would say, 20 years, and that's a ridiculous amount of lag to be done. So the other point that I would respond to was Daniel's point about measuring ICT productivity by spending. Yes, it's a very, very bad way of measuring ICT effort and the competence of ICT effort, especially nowadays. But for the big transactional services that we were looking at, it's a reasonable proxy. But what it isn't a reasonable proxy is anymore. It is the case that government is addicted to very expensive ways of doing things, and very expensive IT, and political power in IT departments and divisions tends to go where the money is, even where free cost or low cost alternatives are available. And it's also the case that modern digital development is mainly, to do with internet and social media and other kinds of expertise, where cost is not really so terribly important. You can get a lot of stuff done very, very cheaply indeed. So certainly if we were doing this next 10 years, we wouldn't be able to use ICT spending, even in those services that we have. That's one of the things I like doing. I was on a tour of Australia the other year, and you would say to conferences of civil servants, how many of you are using Skype? And maybe half the audience in your personal life. Half the audience would put their hand up and then would say, how many of you are using Skype in your official business? 300 people in the room, not one hand would go up. And this would be in places like Western Australia, where they have huge distances, where they have 40 or 50 different Aboriginal languages, where interpreting services are incredibly hard to do. But they still wouldn't use Skype because it wasn't secure enough. So, two very sharp questions on very sharp topics.
Let's reverse the order. Edwin, you can go next. Pick up whatever you like.
With regard to the issue on standards, I think that part of the issue that we've seen, especially with agentification in OECD countries, is that by giving agencies the flexibility to try to meet their mandates, we were hoping that there would be greater innovation in order to deliver and therefore improve productivity. Instead, what we often found is that they would maintain the sort of the rigid administrative rules about salary, about recruitment. Those things they would maintain, and then they would actually apply their flexibility to broadening their mandate in order to try to do more and more and more. So I think that now perhaps one of the ways to introduce the greater flexibility is through the use of block grants, through the use of providing funds to local communities so that they can try to combine flows in different ways in order to provide services that are more adapted to the local needs. An important issue there, and we looked at this in Finland with their basic services program, is that they did exactly that. So they said, we're going to give you your education funding, your health funding, your social service funding, and it's all yours, and you can do with it as you please. And in fact, especially the small local municipalities, they continued to work as they had before under very rigid regulatory frameworks because they didn't know any better. So how do we provide that additional impetus so that they can break out of those regulatory rigidities?
Thank you. Joe, anything you want to add?
Just two very, very quick points, if I might. First of all, I'm certainly not an expert on this, but in terms of the correlation between IT spend and perceived productivity growth, it didn't sort of surprise me that the relationship existed. And part of the reason I say that is I think there's a growing body of evidence that equally, if you look at private sector bodies using the micro data, for example, then again you get this very clear correlation between successful and productive private sector enterprises and their degree of IT spend. Now, my guess is that that may be slightly a false correlation in the sense it may be actually that productive go-ahead enterprises both in the public and the private sector also tend to spend a degree of money on IT. They take it seriously. Whether they spend it wisely or not, I think is another question, but I think there is a clear correlation between IT spend and productivity in both public and private sectors, and getting to the bottom of that I think is quite interesting. The other point that came to mind, I think, was the point that you made about the proposition that a low productivity, large public sector can be burdensome. It seems to me part of the issue here is that not only do public services, the public sector, affect that 22-24% of the economy directly, they also condition the way the rest of the economy, and indeed us as citizens and consumers, are able to benefit or otherwise. So my guess is that the killer is when you have a low productivity, large public sector, which is barely providing those services that the rest of us need, the rest of the economy needs, but doing it in an expensive way and preempting a lot of the national resources in the process. So my guess is that that's really what's at the heart of the finding that Patrick drew attention to. And for me, the thing to bring out is that these public services have a life beyond their direct impact. They do actually condition the rest of the economy and indeed the rest of our society.
Yeah, a couple of things really. I've only a few months ago I did a review of Cornwall and its Cornwall Council, and it's a long way from Catford, Cornwall, and it's very different. And I think it's odd, isn't it, that if you think of different places like Cornwall, Camden, Coventry, why would we expect, I don't know, pharmacists or shops to be the same and accessibly the same? Why would we expect public services to be the same? Well, actually, they're not. The issue is how much of the variance arises because of incompetent management or incompetent leadership or poor organisational performance. And I think that we've got to be much more grown up about variation and diversity, much more grown up about it, rather than assuming a standardised service and assuming that public services are about minimum standards, because they just drive to the minimum, in my view. That's what it results in. Now, I actually started work in computerising housing departments and social care departments' operational systems. I remember doing a mortgage system on a Commodore PET years ago. And it's much easier in local authorities because you're distributing the cost and the risk. So if you've got hundreds of different authorities doing things, you're distributing the cost and the risk. When you're computerising and issues about, HMRC or DWP, you're centralising the cost and the risk. What a surprise. 80% of everything goes wrong in my experience, including implementing computer systems. It's no more likely to go wrong than everything else. 80% of everything in your life will go wrong. You learn from it quickly and move on. The trouble is when you centralise cost and risk, you're locked into the failure, I'm afraid.
Edwin wants to make another point, and then we'll come back for another batch of questions.
I just wanted to add the flip side to Patrick's corollary that large governments that are inefficient cannot raise or reduce inequality, but large governments that are efficient can very productively provide public services. And so there is actually no correlation between size of government and fiscal sustainability, for example. And even The Economist made that point with regard to its survey on the Nordic countries recently.
Thank you. Question over here, and then one in the middle.
Dan Sheldon from Methods. Just to come back to the theme of technology, there seems to be a lot of hope pinned on the kind of second wave of digital services to be able to provide significant productivity savings for governments. I think the Cabinet Office estimates, 7.5 billion per annum in savings just through the kind of low-hanging fruit. That's the high transactional volume services and digitising those. And they also indicate that perhaps this second wave of digital might prompt a wider redesign of organisations around digital. Does the panel share this optimism? And how would you avoid what Patrick alluded to earlier, which is the kind of hostage situation that we've had in the past between governments, which tends to have low levels of digital innovation and also quite a wide skills gap when it comes to technology, traditionally, and the private sector, who have operated quite a monopolistic kind of system for the past few years when it comes to IT.
Thank you. One in the middle here.
Hi, my name is Pat Willerton. I'm from the School of Government and Public Policy at the University of Arizona in the U.S. My question is to the authors, Professor Dunleavy and Dr. Carrera, regarding the cross-national implications of the study. As I understand your work, it's focused on the UK. Perhaps given where I'm from, I'm really taken, let me say, I'm very taken by the title of your book, which I think, as you sell it in the United States, will be quite provocative. Because I think, as you know, we do not associate productivity with the government at all. And in fact, I was thinking about how I would title this book were I an American author. In a typical U.S. thinking, it would be probably not growing the productivity, but managing the burden of government services. And so my question is, in a sense, not to focus particularly on the United States, but perhaps looking at other countries, what are the implications that maybe people elsewhere can take from your study? I think in particular, right now, when all countries are obviously struggling with some of these issues, and I just have the sense, listening to the presentation, when we have a practitioner, when we have an official from a borough of London and embracing your study. Again, I'm not accustomed to this. I mean, I'm accustomed to officials being very apologetic. I mean, even when they get involved in these things and they want to promote these things, they do so apologetically. So clearly, I understand I'm in a country with a different mindset, but at the same time, I want to benefit from the study. So I'm hoping you can comment on the implications.
Thank you. I'm going to take one last question here, except I would like to ask if any other women in the room who've been quiet since the first round of questions would like to ask one. No? Okay, then.
Okay, thank you. Peter Kane from Central Government. Two observations, really. The first is whether if the data was brought up to date reflecting events of the last 3 or 4 years, whether you'd see quite a different picture, because at a time when private sector productivity has been falling, I suspect we'll have seen public sector productivity rising as inputs. Numbers have fallen quite sharply, pay's been restrained quite sharply. And yet, my experience is that outputs are largely being maintained. There's a question of whether that's sustainable, but that's a picture of recent developments. I'd be interested observation on that. And the second is, I think the thing that links both the public and private sector historically is low productivity. And I think, to me, there's a real cultural issue that links the two. It's not so much about levels of IT in comparative, it's more about the extent to which we value good and effective management, and the extent to which we're getting the value from the workforce and creating the value through that. So perhaps by comparison with other countries, that's the area where we should be focused.
Thank you. I know there are a couple of other hands, but we're almost out of time, and we can carry on the conversation over the reception anyway. So let me turn first to the panel, see if there are any quick comments on those, and then let Patrick have the last word.
Well, actually, I know David Cavassos, who's the city manager for Phoenix, and I think he's a very good example of effective management. It's a city management authority. When we started going into the crash in the UK, I studied American cities because they had to essentially cut their budgets 2 years before the UK authorities, because we were essentially cushioned because they were too over-reliant on business rates. We're going to become reliant on business rates. So we're being given fallen knives in the UK and told this is a lifeline. But I do think there's some really good examples in the States of very good productivity, but I think that where it focuses on is single-purpose agencies in the main, whether that's in local government or in other areas. There's lots of single-purpose agencies, whereas in the UK, there's much more general-purpose agencies where there's less productivity because the cost of coordination and the problems that occurred from coordinating lots of different specialties.
Quick reaction from you, Joe?
Very quick. First of all, the United States, I can barely suppress observing that while, as Patrick pointed out, for a long time most of the rest of the world had an outputs equals inputs convention, so productivity never changed. For large parts of the US national accounts, I think no longer, but for a long time, they had a convention that inputs equaled zero. In other words, there was no output from the input whatsoever, and by definition, any government spending was waste. So that does rather fit in. I think they've changed from that, by the way. But, just on Peter Kane's point about the latest information we have on productivity in the public sector has been pretty flat for areas like the health service, for example, or schools. So flat as a pancake, I think, would be the way I would say it. That is, of course, different from the private sector, where, as you say, in the UK we've had this rather sharp fall in productivity over the last years. But I do rather agree that, in particular, it's a bit of what I was trying to say before, the correlation between IT spend and productivity may not be a direct one. It may simply be a symptom of those wise, foreseeing managers happen to do that kind of thing, in which case it would not be a good policy prescription to say all you have to do to get productivity is to spend lots of money on IT. You have to be a sort of certain kind of manager, good manager, to do that in the first place.
Thanks, Joe. Edwin.
With regard to the question on digital services, I think that one of the things I liked very much in the book was not only this raising the need for competitiveness of service delivery within government, but also recognizing that sometimes you need a little bit of slack so that you can have competition. And I think that one of the problems with digital service delivery estimates is oftentimes it's about cutting out all the slack so that we have a single provider. And yet the track record of government of picking winners is not so high. So I think that while there is certainly low-hanging fruit to be had, perhaps we should take a medium estimate of savings rather than an optimal estimate of savings. And then rather than looking at what the US can learn from the UK, I think what a question that all countries can learn in the current crisis is that organizations can innovate if they have a bit of certainty. So if they know that there is going to be a reduction in their resources and that they can plan and try to achieve those. When they're in a context of complete fiscal chaos, it makes it very difficult. They get into a defensive posture, and trying to expect any improvements in productivity, I think, is pretty much wishful thinking.
So Patrick, you get the last word, bearing in mind that you are the only person between us and the reception.
Okay, well that certainly incentivizes me greatly. I hope that the book will be, applicable to the USA. There's a lot of US literature in there. There's a lot of US productivity studies that we draw on, particularly some very interesting studies of US police services and so on. In most of my other work, my last book had a 7-country study, included the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and Netherlands. And most of my papers are cross-national. So I hope that this book has a lot of resonance for particularly big US public services like IRS and like the Social Security Agency, which I've visited many times and which are always full of fascinating insights and so on. So this, how do you run very big national level agencies? The US has some of the biggest in the world, and the record has been very critical from US politicians and US public, but when you're running, services at a scale for 300 million people, that probably is a gargantuan task, and there's a lot to be learned. On Dan's point about the second wave of digital services, let me just refer you to my blog that Leandro and I did on Monday, which is called "The Rise of a Robot State?" Which runs through some of the very extensive, potential for fully automating. I mean, zero-touch technology automating government services. And the really tricky thing for government really is to do that properly without making it a kind of Ryanair, we hate you kind of provision. Oh dear, that's recorded.
Oh dear.
But there's a huge potential, and it's not going to get less. It's going to get more and more. Finally, on Peter's point about central government productivity, what is the current picture? Well, we've got very mixed signals, really, from the public sector. So the government has been all around the public sector saying, top managers, you're paid way more than the Prime Minister, give me the money back. It's instituted a 3-year pay freeze, which creates what we call the Swiss cheese problem, where all the talented people leave and all the people who can't move stay. On the whole, that tends to produce not very committed workers also, and there will anyway be a catch-up pay settlement. So it's not a sustainable increase. And if you look back through the record, there are, in all the chapters that cover central government, you will find peaks. There were peaks under previous Conservative administrations. There was a peak in 1995 to 97. It's completely unsustainable because it's not grounded in the real organic processes. So flat rate, wage cuts and wage freezes, they make your figures look good for a year and then they go away again. And often they create efficiency reducing and efficiency impairing changes as well. So, there is no substitute for actually getting down to the organic job of improving and sustaining government productivity in each individual agency. And that's also, I might just say, why mandatory efficiency dividends, or what Edwin called automatic productivity, never works. That just means I'm going to take 3% off you at the end of the year. It doesn't have any effect on productivity. It just makes the finance ministry feel better.
On that note, congratulations to Patrick and Leandro on their book, which is terrific. And thank you to all of you for coming along. It's been a great series of questions, and I know that there are others we didn't get to, so I hope we can carry on the conversation in a little while over drinks. And finally, please would you join me in thanking the panel and Patrick in the usual way.